Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and Season 1 of War Within is in full swing, but it doesn't mean that Blizzard isn't there working, cooking behind scenes for the next feature update of 11.05, otherwise known as the WoW's 20th anniversary. And with this update, we've been seeing so far quite a decent bit of class changes. Not every single class is getting adjusted, but the ones that are seeing some sizable revamps. And looks like the class of Rogue is also on that chopping block, but in the best way possible, as they're finally fixing some of our heroes specs, with Trickster Outlaw finally becoming a viable build. But they're also doing some fundamentally big changes, with Subtlety rogues changing up their cooldowns by removing cooldown reduction mechanic, but giving them even more micro bursts that you'll be able to weave into your rotation. We'll also giving all three specs of rogues some nice quality of life general class changes as well. So for today's video, I want to take a look at the entire set of class and talent revamps coming to the class of rogues so far for the 20th anniversary. As always, if you want to see more regular updates like these, take a look at future builds, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. Otherwise, let's dive right into everything they're cooking up for the class of rogue. So, for the day, we have a lot of things to take a look at, but before we dive into the general rogue changes, the hero spec stuff, and the actual spec stuff, which are all very, very good. Before all that, though, we do have an important announcement. As part of the 20th anniversary, all the classes are getting a new version, or an updated version of their Tier 2 sets. The Rogues one is an iconic Bloodfang set, which looks amazing on undead rogues in particular, and they actually got a model over on the PTR. It looks so good. It fits that original aesthetic. They got the shrouded face with the glowy red eyes. They even gave it a cloak too, which the original didn't really have a cloak before it, but this cloak kind of sort of matches it. The actual padding on the side, the armor bits, the metal bits, and they even got like little straps here on the side, like 3D bits. It looks so good. This is an exciting time to play a rogue, but this is just the intro to it, because the actual rogue changes we're getting over on the PTR are incredible, and they offer so much more clarity in the direction they want this class to go. My god, this set looks so good, but the actual talents are also just as good, if not better. Starting off with some of the more generalized rogue changes on the PTR, this talent doesn't work super well yet, but Shadow Step is being replaced with a talent called Thrill Seeking. Outlaw basically loses Shadow Step, or at least in the future build it will, but each spec of rogue will be able to use 2 Shadow Steps, if you can use it. For Outlaw, it'll be 2 grapple hooks instead. So Outlaw will be able to use 2 grapple hooks, or get 2 charges of grapple hook, while the other specs get Shadow Step charges. For Outlaw in particular, there's a nifty talent called Fate Bound, where you can actually double grapple hook after an initial grapple, so you can grapple 4 times in a row. That is a lot of mobility. It's going to be incredible in RBGs. Probably going to get nerfed before this comes out to live, but it seems like they really are increasing rogues' mobility, but in their own unique way. Cut to the chase. As a passive, which is available for all 3 specs of rogue, this one is being adjusted a little bit right now, where you no longer need to have a Slice and Dice active in order to gain Slice and Dice. When you dispatch, Envenom, or Eviscerate, it just generates you a Slice and Dice automatically on its own, even if you don't have one available. So you basically don't ever need to have Slice and Dice in your bars ever, because you'll just automatically generate Slice and Dice. It's almost like they should just replace or remove Slice and Dice out of the game and just make it a passive at this point, because they're finding ways to keep the buff, but they're removing ways where you need to maintain it little by little. Eventually, it's just going to be a passive, isn't it? At some point, I think it's going to be. Some of the other talents going to adjust it is Soothe the Darkness is now going to grant you far more healing, 30% more healing instead of 15, but no longer works for abilities such as Shadow Dance for Subtlety. It only works with Vanishes, so Vanishes are going to grant you far more healing, which is really good in situations such as PvP in particular. Then we have the talent of Subtlety, which is getting a couple of new things. They're trying to make rogues a little bit less complex rotationally, so they're changing Subtlety so it's an ability that right now it looks like it's an on-use ability, but they're trying to make it so it can be procced whenever you drop below 30 energy. The ability will automatically get used up. An interesting move, but the problem is Subtlety does have Mastery attached behind it. So for specs like Subtlety and Assassination, you're going to always weave Subtlety inside of your major cooldowns, and having the game automatically use the charge of Subtlety for you, I think is going to get a little bit annoying, especially if you're trying to save those Subtlety charges for specific moments. I think honestly there should probably be 2 versions of Subtlety. One that's active so that rogues can weave it in during very key moments with other cooldowns, because you don't really use it on its own just for energy. But then you should also get a separate version that does act passively. Like, there should be at least a choice for players to either control it or just get it actively used, because depending on the spec, you're going to use this ability completely differently. Now, another set of rogue changes that we're going to see is in the middle row for the capstones with a new talent called Supercharger. Roll the Bones, Shiv, as well as Symbols of Death now supercharges a combo point, making that combo point worth more. Damage and finishers consuming a supercharged combo point now function as if they spent 2 additional combo points. So the way that it works is, let's say you're building up combo points against a training W. You have full 5 combo points right now. I press Roll the Bones. 2 of my combo points become blue. That means my next finisher is going to consume one of those combo points, so instead of spending 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 combo points into a finisher, it's going to consume one of them as if I spend 9, so 2 more are added. So when I use an ability like Dispatch, it hits a little bit harder. So when I build another, and every one of the finishers only consumes one of those supercharged combo point. So then my next finisher is going to consume the next one. They're trying to make the whole like Echo and Reprimand playstyle for Outlaw, Rogue, Subtlety, and Assassination a little bit easier to play around. So they just simply are buffing your next finisher to function as if it consumed more combo points. But then you can further upgrade it with the talent below, either with Forced Induction, which increases the bonus granted with a damaging finisher increased by 1 combo point. So instead of providing it as if 2 extra combo points get consumed, instead going to be 3 extra combo points. Or after consuming those anima charge combo points, your next Sinister Strike, Backstab, or Mutilate will also do a follow-up attack called Echo and Reprimand, which deals additional physical damage. Now, I've been testing the Echo and Reprimand ability a little bit. It seems to hit a decent bit, but I'm not sure if this ability is supposed to generate a combo point. And technically, Reprimand was originally a ability that was an extra combo point builder, but now they're trying to make it into like a passive ability, so maybe there's some leftover spaghetti code that sometimes causes it to function erratically. From what I'm reading though, it's just meant to deal additional physical damage that kind of follows up after a Backstab, Mutilate, or a Sinister Strike. But sometimes, as all 3 specs, for me at least, in the current build, it's generating combo points. Not sure if it's meant to or not meant to. If it is meant to, I think it's going to be very interesting for that combo point generation economy. Would be really interesting on top of it. If it's just meant to be a passive proc damage, I think the damage buff could probably be a little bit better. It all depends exactly how they end up coding the ability or how it's supposed to function in a future build. Hopefully we'll get some clarity on it at some point in the future. But just those changes alone with some of these abilities, some of these new talents, it's already making this whole talent tree with finisher focus a little bit more interesting, a little bit more nuanced as to what potentially you could bring for the class of Rogue, as either of the specs, and all specs utilize finishers in different ways. Besides this, we have a couple of other changes, like in PvE content, Cheap Shot now stuns targets for 6 seconds. So if you need to vanish Cheap Shot a target within like a dungeon or a raid or anything like that, that full Cheap Shot will now have a 6-second value, which is so much better than having it to be a 4-second value, because Cheap Shots only generates 1 combo point. It was never really all that worth it. Usually it just vanishes for your personal power, not for stunning anything, but this is going to be really nice, and I think it's going to allow rogues to have a little bit better control, at least within PvE content. The talent of Subterfuge now functions for a bunch of other abilities, so anything that gets empowered by stealth states actually also functions for Subterfuge as well. So things such as Taken by Surprise actually will have a longer duration, 26 seconds after breaking stealth, which is really, really cool. For Assassination, is going to be certain talents such as Improved Garrote, for instance, which gives you 12 seconds after breaking stealth of an empowered Garrote, which is so good too, but also Master Assassin, 12 seconds or 25% more crit. Also, I guess we'll get to Assassination part, but apparently this ability baseline duration has also been greatly increased. But imagine 12 seconds of 25% more crit out of a stealth, out of a vanish. Oh, that is so good. I think it's going to make Assassination so much deadlier than ever before. From there on, though, I do want to move on to some of the other hero talent changes. We're primarily seeing changes to Fatebound and Trickster, so I'll just stay in Outlaw Rogue for this one specifically. Starting off with Fatebound, when it comes to the Destiny Defined and Inevitable and talents. So both of these talents gives you either a slightly higher chance to match your last flip coin or a guaranteed chance to match your flip coin I guess if you're new to Outlaw Rogue or Fatebound Rogues in particular, every time you use a finisher, you flip a coin, either a heads that gives you a damage buff. If you continue to get a heads again and again, it keeps stacking that damage buff by 2%, or a tails, which is just instant cosmic damage, and the more times you flip tails in a row, the more damage that grows every time you flip it. Sometimes, however, coins can land on their edge within certain abilities like Edge Case You, for example. When you activate your Adrenaline Rush or a Death Mark, that's also been adjusted. As soon as you activate those abilities, you flip a coin and it lands on an edge, counting both as heads and tails. Now, this talent right here, the Inevitable and Destiny Defined, have either a guaranteed chance or a slightly higher chance to match the last flipped coin flip. But if the coin landed on the edge, matching both heads and tails, you can actually use this talent to get a guaranteed edge flip again. So it's actually kind of exciting. It could give rogues an incredibly big burst window, but also guaranteed tail stacks or head stacks that allows them to reach that capstone better. It's basically coin flipping, but in such a favor towards the rogue damage output in particular that allows you to reach maximum peak burst as Fatebound and generally an overall buff for that playstyle altogether. As for Trickster, we got a couple of changes, particularly with the capstone, which I never really liked, which is coup de grace, but they changed it and made it much better. So first things first, after you build up to a coup de grace, as a Subtlety or Outlaw, the finisher in the tooltip reads, your next finisher of coup de grace will consume whatever comp points you spend into that next Empowered Eviscerate or Empowered Dispatch, and it will function as if 5 more comp points gets consumed. So if you have 7 comp points and you use coup de grace, it should function like 12 comp points get used. Previously, it increased the damage of that Empowered Eviscerate or Dispatch, but it didn't function with certain class abilities like Outlaw cooldown reduction, which is where whenever you spend comp points into a finisher, you reduce the cooldown of your ability. So now that function works. Same thing for Subtlety, same thing for Assassination. Anything that functions off of you being able to consume comp points into a finisher and you get other effects besides just more damage, all those things now function with coup de grace, making Trickster much better. Also, they removed the animation lock out of Trickster entirely. Previously, when you pressed the ability, you couldn't use any of your character abilities. So you couldn't press coup de grace and then interrupt an enemy spellcast, or coup de grace and then Cloak of Shadows in that next few globals, or coup de grace and then follow up with the next ability, because coup de grace is a finisher, so as soon as you use a finisher, you follow up with a Sinner Strike to start building more comp points, or Backstab to start building more comp points, and having that animation lock was super uncomfortable. Subtlety could sort of play with it, but for Outlaw it was like, you can't play Trickster. It's just not comfortable, but it's also not really great as a gameplay mechanic in general. But now you can see on screen, whenever I do use coup de grace, I can just immediately use abilities that are off GCD. Like, it wouldn't let you use abilities off GCD. Your defenses, you're just basically out in the open. You can't kick, you can't pop a defensive, you can't do anything else. It removed it completely out of the game, making Trickster so much more playable and actually making it a potentially viable playstyle option for Outlaw Rogues going forward within PvE content. Besides this, we got a couple of talent changes for Rogues, in particular all the separate hero specs, starting with Twist the Knife, a talent we haven't really got to play with in a while. When Venom's duration has been increased by 2 seconds by this talent, but also Envenom can now overlap 2 times. So the overlap in talent, or the overlap in effect that it's talking about, is when you press Envenom, you get this passive called Envenom, poison application chance is increased by 30%, and also with a talent of a rapid injection, while the buff is active, your Envenom damage is increased by 10%. So if let's say I have full comp points, I'm going to Envenom, immediately build comp points, and then use Envenom again. It actually ends up stacking up and overlapping those Envenom buffs altogether. I am not sure if it's functioning right now, at least as of this current moment over in the PTR, but it's basically supposed to overlap those buffs. So I guess you could technically increase your weapon application by double, by 60%, and increase the damage of an Envenom by 20% if you can have 2 buffs overlapping at once and use an Envenom again. It's a very interesting playstyle that may make Assassination spend their energy a little bit more aggressively, but also do a bit of pulling. Like, you'll wait until the perfect moment, build up a bunch of energy, and then try to overlap as many Envenoms as possible in this like burst combo inside of your Deathmark window, together with King's Bane, and just try to get the most amount of damage out of those Envenoms back to back. It's a weird talent because it causes Assassination to play a little bit differently than how we've played so far, but I'm wondering I'm interested to see if it'll actually pan out, or if maybe they'll rework it in the next few builds. As for the spec of Outlaw, we saw a couple of changes, such as to the talent of Crack Shot, for instance. Now, when entering stealth, you refresh the cooldown of you between the eyes. This talent change just makes Outlaw play a little bit easier because you just use Between the Eyes, and as soon as the ability is on cooldown and you build up combo points, you can just vanish to reset the cooldown of Between the Eyes, and then you get that stealth state where you can just keep spamming Between the Eyes as your primary finisher, and it just keep resetting over and over. So you just spam Between the Eyes on cooldown, and when you can't use it again, if Adrenaline Rush is active, you'll vanish to reset your Between the Eyes. It's very, very simple. It's a really easy way to play, and it makes Outlaw Rogue even more approachable for newer players because the spec already has a lot going on in the background and makes it a little bit more challenging for new players to pick up. But this just simplifies it by much more. I like this change in general. Also, Blade Flitter range, the cleave range of this ability has been greatly increased. So even in a guy like this guy all the way on this far side, right? I'm nowhere near him, but I'm still able to cleave him from super far away. This used to be part of this extended range that we had before this expansion, so this just makes playing Outlaw Rogue in PvE content just a lot better. It allows you to reach enemies without really putting yourself too close to danger against them, but yeah, it's just a huge quality of life improvement for the spec like Outlaw. It gives you a little bit better mobility, or at least control over where you want to stand, and you don't have to put yourself in like bad spots in order to finally be able to cleave a target you're trying to reach. It's really nice. Now the last spec we can take a look at is Subtlety, which has gotten a few new changes, such as your Flagellation no longer has this Venthior red, now it's gray. I guess the icon is a little different, so I guess that is new. But for Subtlety, we had a couple of new changes, such as a new talent over here called Death Perception. Symbols of Death now has 2 additional charges, so Symbols of Death can have 3 charges. That's going to be interesting, because Symbols of Death can be weaved into multiple different... Well, Symbols of Death is something you play around with, actually, when it comes to your overall burst and damage. Right, you usually use Symbols of Death on cooldown, and you weave in other abilities into Symbols of Death. But now that you have 3 charges of Symbols of Death, you can just be a little bit more flexible with when you use it, and you can always combine it with other cooldowns, and it just makes you a bit more of a cooldown management class, but makes it a little bit less specific or controlled, and actually makes the class give it a bit more freedom. Rotationally, it also does change Symbols of Death, because with the talent of the Rotten, you can now generate a ton of combo points since you have 3 charges of the ability, so that can be very... actually kind of nuts when it comes to just overall resource generation, as long as you do some good cooldown management. So as a new talent is being added for a spec like Subtlety, some talents are being removed, such as Sepsis, no longer on choice now with that availability, and taking the place of Death Perception is a removal of Invigorating Shatter Dust. Subtlety no longer has any cooldown reduction tied to the spec whatsoever. You can't vanish to reduce the cooldown of your abilities. That's going to feel very weird in terms of timing it for raids and dungeons, which at first feels like, oh, they're making Subtlety weaker. But I think it's also an opportunity where they could tune Subtlety so you could have a very strong 2-minute window. Because before this, they had 2 builds they had to tune Subtlety for. A 2-minute burst window and a 1.5-minute burst window. One of those builds is better in certain boss fights, while the other is better in other boss fights. So now they made Subtlety specifically a 2-minute burst class, but they also give you a little bit more flexibility with Symbols of Death depending on how you talent into your rogue. So maybe it'll be a class with a very strong 2-minute burst window, and then have a little micro burst in between. This works out, I think, okay, if they're able to tune the class accordingly. And I don't think they did any tuning over on the PTR at all. So I'm assuming they're going to end up tuning the class so that it can have a very strong 2-minute window and then microbursts in between, which actually could make it pretty fun. Like if you're someone who just likes to play a class all around burst, Subtlety may end up being the class that's literally focused on microbursts and then a big burst window, and that could be really fun all in all, as long as it's tuned correctly. To make Subtlety line up in that 2-minute window a little bit better, Flagellation is being changed from a 1.5-minute cooldown to a 1-minute cooldown. So you'll be able to combine Shadow Blades and Flagellation during your opener, then you'll have a separate Flagellation a minute after, and then a minute after that you'll be able to have those abilities sync back up again, so it gives it more structure. And I think it's probably good for the spec to have more structure. Cooldown reduction mechanics can be really fun, but when you have one cooldown that's 2 minutes, one that's 1.5 minutes, things can desync pretty easily, so I think having structure is probably going to be better and healthier down the line, as long as it's tuned accordingly. But with that being said, that's going to be literally everything that we've seen from the Rogue so far, at least so far, in the current build on the PTR, and these changes all look really good. They're fixing rogues in such a good way. Excited for the changes to Trickster, excited for all the changes coming to the base class talent trees, as well as the individual changes coming to Assassination, Outlaw, and Subtlety. And I'm excited to see how Subtlety in particular plays with microbursts, but more importantly, I'm excited for Outlaw because there's some nice quality of life stuff being added specifically for Outlaw rogues that wanted to play Trickster but couldn't, and now they'll finally be able to. As always, I want to thank all of you guys so much for watching this video, and I hope all of you enjoyed. If you did enjoy it or found this update informative, go ahead and give it a like. I would very much appreciate it. Join the community to discuss all these rogue changes over with the rest of the homies there. As always, leave me your thoughts in the comments down below. What do you think about all of these changes? And I'll see all of you guys in the next one.